working closely with your business partners and that collaboration seamlessly is probably more important than anything else.
Welcome to the LearnOps Leadership Series. Today we have David Barone coming onto this series to talk about his experience within learning operations in general. David, welcome. Thanks for coming on. Appreciate your time today. I guess to kick things off, I'm always curious about learning about people's stories. I mean, how did you get into L&D?
It's kind of an interesting, path I took. I started actually originally working at nuclear power plants. So the question is, how does nuclear power plant get to L&Ds? But did a lot of work in the operations side, was at Exelon, came over to Comcast, did some work on the ops side as they started up what they called Comcast Business, or a B2B business, and it took off. It went from like $500 million to $8 billion. And while it was taking off, they said, we need to put some kind of college together to serve it. So they called me up and said, Dave, do you want to run the Comcast Business College? I said, sure, I'll give it a try. Never did L&D, trained a lot of technicians at the power plant. So did that for a while, went from about 4 employees to 50. Really enjoyed it. Then I took over Comcast University Innovation and was responsible for all the L&D technology for about 100,000 employees across Comcast. So that was fun. And then my COO left. And when my CLO left, I decided to leave and had a good relationship with Josh Bersin. Josh asked me to help him out with some white papers. So I did some of that work. And now I'm doing some consulting for Josh Bersin at some Fortune 100 companies. So that's the path.
Talking about those jobs, I mean, what type of problems did you see along the journey and most recently as well?
They're two different worlds. I mean, as a consultant, I've done some L&D optimization projects. I've done some forward-looking learning strategy. But when you're a consultant, you're really asked to solve a specific problem. And I think the corporate world is kind of different where there's multiple specific problems you're trying to solve. And it's more about prioritization. So at Comcast, probably a couple of problems I needed to work on or overcome. One was at Comcast Business, I talked to you about how it grew from $500 million to $8 billion. So that was the proverbial changing the tires while the car was moving. They were rolling out new products. They were changing the names of the products. They were changing what the products did. So we had to be extremely fast-moving in a constantly changing organization, and L&D could not be in the way. We couldn't sit there and say, what are you trying to solve for? What are the competencies and all that? It was like, you guys either move fast or we'll move without you. So we just figured out ways to use technology to move as fast as a business that allowed us to kind of meet the learners where they were learning. So that was one thing. With that, though, I think you have to kind of put down some guardrails with the business. We told them, we don't do pilots. There's too much change happening in pilots. Learning can't help you there. We can learn from the pilots, but we can't do it. So we put some different rules together to kind of help them understand what we could do well and how we could help them. And that really helped the conversation.
And Comcast being such a large organization as it is, what's interesting about your role is you came in when this function was really new. I mean, some of the audience members who are probably watching aren't working on within an L&D team at that scale. What was the blueprint that you kind of laid in from when you first came in, and what did you see throughout until you ended up leaving? Where was the organization when you first started from a maturity level within L&D operations to then when you exited?
Comcast University was the L&D organization for all of Comcast, and we were about 400 employees serving all of Comcast. I ran a specific college, which was Comcast Business, which was about 50 people serving about 15,000 people. But the difference was, I think most of Comcast was pretty established, and what I was doing was kind of more fast moving. So our CLO said, there's no way you can use all the processes and operational, things we're using, infrastructure, to be successful in your role because it's just moving too fast. So we came there with, a little bit hair on fire, kind of running with the business side by side, just trying to respond to their needs. And then eventually we kind of took this control where, we explained to them sometimes you have to slow down to speed up. Like I said, put some processes together, use a lot of technologies. It kind of changed their mindset. Before, I think L&D was more of, I don't say a nuisance, but something that kind of got in the way, a necessary evil. And then when we started showing them some of the results of what we're doing and kind of moving fast, it kind of changed their mindset to, hey, we can't start doing this until we get Comcast University involved. Hey, did anyone talk to Dave Barone's team? So I think we convinced them, that there's value of us having a seat at the table. So I think that worked out pretty well.
So you got to be a little bit entrepreneurial where you came in and they're like, hey, given this business line that you're going to have oversight on, the traditional way on how we do things isn't really going to work. So you had to come up with a new operating model on how to really streamline processes, overcome challenges using technology, et cetera. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think what we had to do is ironically, maybe technologies we had in the past or operational systems we had in the past were probably a little bit more slower moving, and it wouldn't just meet the needs. So we kind of had to reinvent ourselves. It wasn't like a 20-step process to require training. It was us sitting side by side with the business. And, when they move left, we move left. So when they asked us something, we knew as much about their business as they did. So we could actually kind of work closely with them. And it wasn't like a handoff to L&D to get something done. Although we were centralized, we were like side by side as far as business partners go.
I was just going to ask you that because you and I have worked. You came in to help Synapse as an advisor as well, and we're really excited about that. One of the first conversations we had was around operating model. So I was going to ask, what type of operating model were you really following while at Comcast?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So Comcast was extremely centralized. We were probably one of the more centralized L&D organizations, which was kind of interesting because, usually when you're centralized, the knock is that you're more, you're not close with the business, you're kind of distanced from the business. It doesn't seem to work that well, but we were the exact opposite. Our CLO just said, guys, for us to be successful in this role, you guys have to understand the business and be part of the business and understand the business as well as they know the business. And we hired a lot of instructional designers. We also hired people from the business. And it was interesting because we created colleges that were very, forward-looking towards their business partners. And it was interesting because we used to say things like we were probably the most decentralized, centralized organization because each college used to act their own way. So like Comcast Business College would work close with the business and the business would tell us, here's the technologies we needed. And it was kind of business partner first, not, hey, let's make sure what we're doing fits the mold of what everyone else is doing at Comcast University. So it was kind of interesting that we kind of had the best of both worlds. We were very focused on the business, but we were centralized where we could share ideas. And I think probably where we were moving later on was let's continue to have the conversation with the business, but let's try to figure out how we can work together across colleges and develop a similar operational model so we can kind of gain efficiencies from each other.
And how did it work? Having these close partnerships, how did you interact with the subject matter experts within each of the businesses as well?
We had different tools we used, probably not as successful. It was probably more of a one-on-one, side-by-side review things. We had a couple tools we used, Adobe and things like that where you can go back and forth and do comments. But I think since we had such a strong knowledge of the business, we didn't rely on SMEs that much. It wasn't like, hey, SMEs, help us give us the content. It was SMEs, take a look at this content and sign off on it. But, for us to be successful in rolling out technologies, L&D technologies or content, working closely with your business partners in that collaboration seamlessly is probably more important than anything else.
LearnOps in general is very complicated. Too many times we see L&D teams trying to solve specific problems of LearnOps versus looking at it holistically, managing requests with SharePoint, then prioritizing projects in some other tool, and it really breaks the data flow. That's one of the challenges we've been seeing. But when it comes to LearnOps or L&D operations in the industry, what are some of the biggest challenges that you've noticed?
I think part of the DNA of the learning world is more about just being more creative, predominantly right side brain, the creative type. And I think L&D in the future, where we're going with these different technologies and obviously just the whole data infrastructure, I think we have to start being a little less creative and a little bit more focused on, we'll say, the other side of the brain, which is more maybe focused on that operational efficiency. So it's interesting. I've talked to Josh before about, we joke around and say the L&D organization needs more engineers. So I think what's happening, and I've done some work with Red Thread, and they put something out recently that said from like 2018 to 2020, there was like a 45% increase in L&D technologies. I think as you start rolling out new technologies and figuring out ways things work, I think it's less about being creative and it's more about making sure you have an operational plan to support it. I think the technologies are the creativity, but I think you need that operational plan to support it. So I think that mindset moving forward is more about how can we make this operationally efficient than how can we have the greatest VR technology that maybe doesn't talk to this or the learner can't find it.
Just going back to that centralized model, for some of the viewers or some of the guests who are watching this today, you and I have talked about federated model, decentralized models as well. What are some of the challenges that you're seeing, the pros or the cons between the three various models that are often found within L&D? And are you seeing any other models as well?
You can get the whole pros and cons chart out there about each model, and I think what you have to do as you're building the model, and like I said, I'll think of Comcast University where we were a totally centralized model, and the knock is you're kind of separate from the business. So you have to figure out ways to, when you build the model, understand the weaknesses and come up with ways to overcome that weakness. I do think on the decentralized model, which I've done some work at some companies that are extremely decentralized, what you see is they're close to the business, they're responding to them, they're efficient, but I don't think you get the innovation that you would get because you've got all these kind of cottage type 4, 5, 6 person L&D organizations that aren't talking to other organizations. They're not combining their budget to maybe come up with new technologies or new ideas. So everything's kind of done one off. So I think you suffer a little bit from the innovation piece, and I think just from an efficiency and a spend piece, you spend probably a lot more money when you're decentralized. So I know there's a lot of talk of that federated model where it's a little bit of both and maybe centralized is some of the key functions. So those conversations are occurring, but it seems like the federated model seems to fit the needs to what everyone's doing. But obviously there's different levels, degree if you are more on the decentralized or centralized side of that model.
Notoriously, L&D has been challenged to actually aggregate the right data sets and to make it available in a really visual way, like some of the other departments or functions in a business have already done, whether it comes to DevOps, RevOps, even HR ops, for example. You see sometimes decentralized HR teams, but they have these HRIS platforms that allow you to collect all the data. Would you say that one of the problems, regardless of what your operating model is just like, how does L&D really piece together this information? So even if you are decentralized, you can still look at the data sets to innovate that?
I totally agree. I think what we're seeing is a lot of companies, every company will say, we're going to measure the data and we got to make sure that our learning is driving business impact and all that. And once again, it's easy to say, but if you want to articulate a true post-learning strategy, you need to develop a very strong pre-learning strategy. And this is much more complex than, just ask the business, what metrics are you trying to drive? It goes back to, I might have told this before, Ryan, the old joke kind of like how to invest $1 million. First step, get $1 million. It's like, what? The problem isn't the investment piece. It's not that easy to get $1 million. So if you want to measure impact, you can't just say, ask them what they need to actually measure. You've got to have a process in place to actually be able to measure that. And you can't have L&D organizations spending weeks after launches and trying to figure out, how do I pull this data? How do I compare this data? So it really starts with that comprehensive L&D data learning strategy. And it's funny, I did some work for Josh just talking to a bunch of companies about data learning strategies. And I said, it's funny, I can divide the companies up into two different flavors. When you say, what's your L&D data architect looks like, half the companies will pull out a one-pager and show this really nice diagram showing like, here's, we've got a data lake here, this talks to this talks to that, and they got this whole strategy mapped out. Someone actually thought through what their data strategy is, how we're going to push data to a common platform, how are people going to be able to access the data and run, compare it to ops data. Then there are the people that say, They start trying to explain to you what there is. They can't pull out a one-page diagram. And unfortunately, if you can't simplify your data strategy in a one-page diagram, you probably don't have a strategy. And this is kind of out of their norms, right? L&D people aren't data people. They talk to the IT team that aren't L&D people. So I think this is where that engineering piece comes into play, where L&D people have to be a little bit more technical and be able to think this through and not actually ask IT to solve their problem, but work with IT to solve their problem. And they can have that kind of L&D lens. I mean, you think about like advertising teams now, and I've never worked in advertising, but I guarantee when they run an ad, people say, was that ad impactful? There is probably a laundry list of data that comes out of that, where someone looked at it, they figured it out, they looked at how many hits they had, how many people bought things. I just don't think that L&D in general is up to that sophistication level. I don't think it's hard to get there, but I think it just takes that mindful thinking about how to get there and what the plan is, and all your decisions are aligned to that plan.
No, I agree. I mean, we haven't really had the tooling in the L&D world to be able to do that, like marketing or ads teams. Although I do think, it's coming. That's definitely the future of where L&D is actually paying attention to the operational side, paying attention to the data side of things. Otherwise, there's no way to really make these teams more efficient. They need to be effective because L&D is becoming more of a strategic pillar in business as businesses realize the value that these L&D teams can have on them. So, the industry needs to really make a push to innovate here, to make these teams more successful so that the businesses can be successful, in my opinion. What other big challenges are you seeing that are holding L&D back from operational efficiency?
My opinion is I think we've been handcuffed to the LMS a little too much. In defense of the LMSs, they can't do everything. So these companies that think, I'm going to use my LMS for my data. I'm going to use my LMS for where learners go and get their learning. I'm going to use my LMS for learning the flow of work. Unfortunately, there's hundreds of platforms that are specifically designed to do all these things. And you have these LMS trying to be the jack of all trades. Companies are investing in their LMSs. Obviously, it's a big part of their ecosystem, and there's a lot of things they have to utilize from it. But I think we have to figure out how to move away from the LMS being that central point. I think we need LMSs. I think they're important. But I don't know if we keep relying on that LMS to be that centralized brain for everything we do. I think we're selling ourselves short. So I think we have to start learning how to add these new technologies in, these new platforms in, and have that data and operational architectural strategy that when this new platform comes in, it kind of is like seamless. It's kind of like a puzzle piece fitting in versus saying, let's throw it in and now it doesn't talk to this, or it can't do that, or our business partners are going to 7 different places to find training. So I think the world of L&D has to be a little bit more smarter, I think, around infrastructures and architectures around their data and their platforms and their technologies. And that's it's causing a lot of agita, a lot of L&D organizations right now.
If you look at the industry, and now it's moving fast towards more of an agile, iterative, consolidative process that's very hyper-focused on strategy and performance, it kind of is going against where the LMS is really meant for. I mean, learning management systems aren't newer technologies. There are new vendors out there, but the core thesis is to host, track, deliver, and measure the learning experience on the learner side. But that's not really dealing with the operational side on, was this effective? What business impact did it have for the organization? Were we on track with budgets and the investment that was made? I can appreciate the jack of all trade comment that you made, and you can't be the best of everything. And when you look at the core focus of what problem an LMS is really meant to do, even if they have some of these add-on features, it's not really solving the problem on the operational side. So that really resonates with me as well.
Yeah, and I think the LMSs, they were that centralized spot to go, so they weren't really designed to be plug and play. And I think as we start looking at all these different technologies and different ideas and platforms, I mean, the ability to be able to plug and play is going to be very important. And I know, some of the LMSs are getting there. Other ones, it's just that's not their DNA. They don't want to ingest a bunch of data. They want to be that source for all data. So it's kind of tricky.
Talking about data, what are some of the other common struggles you see within L&D when it comes to gathering data and articulating the impact of learning investments?
Over the years, learning has always kind of looked at, L&D data, less about clicks and more about, butts and seats. They took it, they scored this, kind of your basic SCORM information. And now, as we know, people are, going on YouTube, going to video platforms, taking a look at this, looking at this video for 5 minutes, looking at it for 2 minutes. And I think the world of data measurement has kind of exploded as far as L&D data that's out there. I know there's talk of XAPI, which, seems to be going in the right direction where it measures more than just the SCORM stuff. But I think right now what we're seeing is a lot of people just kind of building their own type of networks or their own data infrastructures to gather things and throw it in a data warehouse and throw some Tableau in there and do their own data analysis. So be it, But I think eventually someone's going to step up and say, you know what, here is kind of that L&D platform, and here's how we make L&D a little bit different. Because I know it's similar when you say data is data, but when it comes to L&D data, I think it takes a little difference in thought process of how you do that. So I do think having L&D specific platforms, L&D specific measurements around data is going to be important. And it's not just the generic, like we're measuring our technicians or measuring our call centers. It is a little different. So I think you need L&D involved and kind of leading the way with IT as opposed to just kind of following IT.
So I think flipping it to where L&D is the owner of this, but having IT support them as a partner, but not having IT own it, because then they can't move fast enough, right? They really need to have these skill sets or work with some sort of solution or technology that is agile enough and where they can iterate on it so that they can do these things at the speed of business. One customer we spoke to, for example, they built a pretty robust system into Power BI, but they needed a data analyst to make sense of it. And because of the time it took to export CSV files from different systems, put it into Power BI, and make sense of it, they ran a monthly report, and by the time they got this information, it was outdated because things changed too fast within the organization. And this is an area, as you know, that Synapse is focusing a lot of attention on, coming up with that data model to be the data analyst and providing the technology so that L&D teams can just focus on their operations, and we'll help them to determine what the best practices are based off of a data set from hundreds of L&D teams. Really interesting conversation, David. Thank you so much for being on today's episode, and really excited about having you help us at Synapse innovate and really help the industry mature in this area.
No, hey, thank you, Ryan. I mean, I like where you guys are going as far as, the operational platform kind of built specific for L&D. And I think, as you expand your offering, I think it's going to be something that's going to be beneficial and almost required for companies to, really take their L&D learning and operations to a level that can compete with the advertising worlds and things like that. So great work you're doing, and I'm glad to be part of it.
Thanks for tuning in to the series. For more information and content on LearnOps, please like, share, and subscribe. Visit getsynapse.com to learn more about our operations platform.